Hi, everyone. This is Jillian with Court Junkie. Court Junkie is a true crime podcast that covers court cases and criminal trials using audio clips and interviews with people close to the cases. Court Junkie is available on Apple Podcasts and podcastone.com.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our look at the JonBenét Ramsey case and listen to the 911 call. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my unequaled co-host, Alice.
I'm not even sure what that means, unequal.
It means you can't be equaled, and you have no equal.
No, I'm such a nerd, because as soon as you said that, I saw, like, the equal sign with the slash through it. Alice does not equal question mark.
I think that would be more of a negative.
Exactly. That's why I was trying to decipher it.
Well, that's Brittany's, and I think she meant it as a compliment.
Thank you, Brittany. Yeah. It's not you, Brittany. It's Brett.
You shouldn't feel offended. You never know with me what I'm going for.
That's my point, Brittany. That is such a kind compliment, Brett. It's the way you said it.
Yeah. You got to stay on your toes. You gotta stay on your toes.
Let's be honest.
Well, Alice, here we are.
We're both a bit loopy because we have driven all over God's green earth today, prepping for a case we have. And I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty tired.
No, I am too. But that is not going to stop us from continuing our look at the JonBenét Ramsey case here in what I believe is part 6. I'm losing count. But I think this is part 6 of the JonBenét Ramsey, which means when we finish this, it will equal the longest we've ever spent on a case. So most likely there will be a part 7. So we're going to beat that record.
We will finish today.
No, I doubt that as well, but that's okay. And, we've spent a lot of time on this case, and now we've gone through a good chunk of stuff. We've talked about the ransom note. We've talked about some of the physical evidence. We've talked about the timeline. And there's one thing when we were discussing the timeline that we highlighted, but we haven't really dived into, and that is the 911 call in this case. Now, look, I know there's a lot of you guys who hate 911 calls. I don't really love them either because I feel like people put way too much in them, either trying to figure out, does it make someone sound guilty? Does it make someone sound like they're hiding something? Is there too much emotion? Is there not enough emotion? And I'll say this, I have heard 911 calls by people who turned out to be murderers where there is no emotion, and it's kind of funny. It seems very obvious. Maybe it's one of those things you know it when you see it, but you listen to their calls and you're like, that's weird. And some people hear that in this case, not so much because there's not emotion, but maybe because there's too much. In any event, we're going to talk about it. We're not going to spend the whole show on it, but we are going to talk about it. We're going to walk through it with you, and you can decide for yourself what you think, which is what we always want you to do.
We're about to play the 911 call made after Patsy found the ransom note and discovered JonBenét was missing.
911 emergency. Police. What's going on? 5515th Street. What's going on there, ma'am? We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please. Explain to me what's going on, okay? There's a note left and our daughter's gone. A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter? 6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old. How long ago was it? I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's dead. Does it say who took her? What? Does it say who took her? I don't know. There's a ransom note here. It's a ransom note? It says SBTC. Victory. Please. Okay, what's your name? Are you Patsy Ramsey? I'm the mother. Oh my God! Please. Okay, I'm sending an officer over, okay? Please. Do you know how long she's been gone? No, I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please. Okay, come. There's somebody. I am, honey. Please. Take a deep breath, please, okay? Hurry. Patsy. Street. What's going on there, ma'am? We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please. Explain to me what's going on, okay? There's a note left and our daughter's gone. A note was left and your daughter is gone? How old is your daughter? 6 years old. She's gone. 6 years old. How long ago was this? I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's gone. Does it say who took her? What? Does it say who took her? I don't know. There's a ransom note here. It's a ransom note? It says SBTC. Victory. Please. Okay, what's your name? Are you Patsy Ramsey? I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please. I'm sending an officer over, okay? Please. Do you know how long she's been gone? No, I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please. Okay, come. There's somebody. I am, honey. Please. Take a deep breath, please, okay? Hurry. Patsy.
Alice, before we continue, I want to talk about one of our favorite sponsors, HelloFresh. And I am not exaggerating there, guys. We love HelloFresh because they make delicious meals that make your life easier. With HelloFresh, you get farm-fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit.
You know, Brett, it's so true. I was so busy at work and was rushing in the door after a long day in court, and my kids were yelling. They were hungry, and I pulled out the Parmesan crusted chicken, had it cooking in minutes. My kids were helping me because it's just that easy. They were opening the packets, and before it was even off the stove, they were asking for bites, and they ate it all up, and it was so good. And what's so great is that HelloFresh delivers pre-proportioned ingredients to your door, including farm-fresh produce that arrives within a week. So you get convenience without skimping on quality. That means you can skip the trip to the grocery store, saving you the wait in long lines and ensuring you don't waste money on excess food. And HelloFresh is 72% cheaper than a restaurant meal of the same quality. And you can save on average over $65 a month when you order HelloFresh instead of grocery shopping. That's money back in your pocket.
You know, Alice, we've been so busy recently with work, and if it weren't for HelloFresh, I'd be eating fast food every day. But instead today, I had the spaghetti with the sausage meatballs, and it was amazing. So you guys need to join us with HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com/TP16 and use code TP16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. Now, you guys may have heard us talk about Green Chef before, and Green Chef is now owned by HelloFresh. And with a wider array of meal plans to choose from, there's something for everyone. I know I love switching between the brands, and now our listeners can enjoy both brands at a discount with us. So once again, go to HelloFresh.com/TP16 and use code TP16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts, and you'll know why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit.
Brett, before we move on, I am proud to say that the Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive. What's one thing you'd purchase with a little extra savings? A weighted blanket, smart speaker, that new self-care trend you keep hearing about? Well, Progressive wants to make sure you're getting what you want by helping you save money on car insurance. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. Discounts like having multiple vehicles on your policy. Progressive offers outstanding coverage and award-winning claim service. Day or night, they have customer support 24/7, 365 days a year. When you need them most, they're at their best.
A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations. Okay, so what you just heard was the call that Patsy made that night, and we're going to walk through it and what she says. But I'm curious, Alice, about your initial reaction to this call. Just as you hear it, does it strike you as odd in any way?
So this was the first time that I heard it in its entirety. I've heard clips, obviously, in documentaries, but to just sit and hear it from beginning to kind of confusing end, no, Brett. I felt a lot of anxiety rise up in my chest as a fellow mother, hearing the anxiety in Patsy's voice. In terms of the spectrum of what I might expect to hear, and we talk about this all the time, there really are no expectations to how someone responds to a tragedy like this. It doesn't fall outside the spectrum of what I may expect to hear, to be perfectly honest. It sounds like a desperate mother making a panicked phone call.
Yeah, I've heard podcasts talk about this and say, oh, it's so obvious she's faking it. And I don't know if this is the first time I've listened to the whole thing or not. Like you, I've obviously heard a lot of this on a lot of different documentaries and examinations of this case, but nothing about this. And it's funny because I've talked about this call before and what people say about it. And listening to it now does not match up with what people say about it. And I'll just say, Patsy may be a great actress. I've no doubt that she might be. She was in pageants. She knows how to put on for people. I've heard that she was interested in acting. Maybe that's what she's doing, but she's doing a good job if that's what it is. Because to me, this sounds like what I would expect from someone who's making a 911 call. And let's walk through some of what she says just to point that out. One thing I've heard before is that Patsy is talking to the 911 operator, but she's not actually giving any useful information. And that's what people who want to say this is a fake 911 call will often point to. They do the same thing in the Michael Peterson case. But what's interesting is, much like the Michael Peterson 911 call, the first thing Patsy says is the address, which is the most important piece of information. Like, at that point, the police are on their way. So if this were a case where she was trying to make the 911 call, but either subconsciously or consciously still putting off the inevitable arrival of the police, she doesn't do a very good job, because she immediately says where the police need to go, and then the 911 operator asks what's going on, and she immediately says we have a kidnapping. You know, unlike the ransom note, she gets to the point.
And let's talk about that. The only purpose of a 911 call is in order to dispatch law enforcement to the location. They cannot investigate any sort of a case over the phone. The person answering the phone is oftentimes a volunteer member. They might be affiliated with anything from Red Cross to firefighters. They are usually not the police department answering the phone, because law enforcement officers are actually out in the field investigating these cases. So the only purpose really of a 911 call is not to investigate a case. It is, in fact, to find a location to dispatch officers to. The 911 person who answers the phone Their job is to try to keep you calm, to help keep you on the line if that is helpful. And they elicit answers from you to keep you talking so that they can better understand the situation. Because if they can help, for example, help walk you through how to do CPR on a baby, for example, they may try to walk you through it. But really the most important part of a call is to find out your location. And Patsy gives that up within the second sentence, really. So just keep that in mind. And kind of on that note as well, Brett, we have spent all day talking to a myriad of witnesses, some who, may or may not be targets, and some who are just innocent bystanders who see things. Generally, are people helpful when left to their own devices to tell us information about something they've witnessed?
That's a great question. And the answer is not really.
No,
because
they're so bad at it, Brett. So bad. This is a very typical response to a very important loaded question with all of the information before them. Yeah, they definitely looked at that in that way. I'm like, who's they? Looked at what? In what way? What are you talking about?
Yeah. That's a really good point.
That's how people talk.
And it ties into this. There's a couple things about this call that I think are interesting. The first is Patsy answers every question she's asked with the answer to the question, which is another thing people sometimes, when you're trying to figure out a 911 call, is this a legitimate call or is it a put on? People will point to the fact that the 911 operator is asking questions and not getting a response. But if you look at this, every question she's asked, she answers. So what's going on there? We have a kidnapping. Explain to me what's going on. There's a note left and our daughter's gone. A note was left and your daughter's gone? Yes. How old is your daughter? She's 6 years old. She's blonde, 6 years old. How long ago was this? I don't know. I just got the note. Does it say who took her? She then attempts to figure that out. SBTC Victory. What's your name? She gives her name. Sending an officer over. Do you know how long she's gone? No, I don't. Like, every question she's asked, she answers. So she's not deflecting.
In fact, she's answering it very directly. She answers questions better than most of our witnesses. You're right. People often deflect, even if they're not trying to lie. People kind of answer the question they want to hear, and she's actually answering as directly as you could possibly want, except what Brett just read to you was a transcript version without the emotion of her voice in there. So you might be distracted by the way her voice sounds, but when you take out the emotion and you just listen to the words, she's absolutely just answering the questions.
And another thing Alice pointed out, when people are trying to tell you information, they often will leave out things because in their mind, they know the answer. So they will say things like, they did this. And you're like, who is they? And they have to tell you. And that's because in their mind, they know exactly who they're talking about. So it's one thing people point to is that she never uses JonBenét's name. She just talks about her daughter. A couple things about that. Number one, I mean, imagine if she had answered the question, we have a note. There's a note left. JonBenét's gone, right? Well, the operator's going to be like, who is JonBenét? That actually is not helpful to use her name. It's more helpful to say who she is. It's their daughter, which immediately tells the operator a lot of information. It's a child. The child is gone. The child has been kidnapped. The child's probably in danger, right? So it's not strange to me that she doesn't use her name, and the operator never asks her what her daughter's name is. It's not a question she asked, and so it's not information that she ever gives. She never asked for a description of JonBenét, but Patsy does give the fact that JonBenét is blonde, which is something people have pointed out as that's weird. And one thing that we have stressed so much is this attempting to analyze the words people use and the way people talk from the comfort of our homes when our child is, asleep downstairs. In my case, is much different from trying to figure out what you would say and how you would say it in a high-stress environment.
Absolutely. We see this a lot when someone is panicked and they're asked to give a description on something. It's usually not a very helpful description, right? What did the car look like? There was a license plate. Like, okay, well, what else about it? And that's very, very common. I mean, and part of that is just panic. It might be that she's picturing her daughter in her mind and she sees the blonde hair. Or because JonBenét had very blonde hair, I bet people commented on it all the time. I bet people said things like, oh, what beautiful hair she has, or, oh, look at that blonde hair and it's so natural.
It's her most striking feature.
It's her most striking feature, absolutely. Something she played up in her, pageants. And I can imagine that however your daughter's most often described to you could be the first descriptor you have come to your mind when asked to describe her.
Yeah, and another thing people point out is just the fact that eventually Patsy hangs up. And I guess there's this feeling among people that you would stay on the line with the dispatcher. And, a lot of this comes from this CBS documentary that I've been slamming the whole time because, and I just got to tell you, I mean, that documentary is such a good example of how you get misled by documentaries. The documentary is a presentation of the book, A Small Foreign Faction by Kohler. That is what it is. Kohler appears in the documentary. It's never explicitly told to you that that's what it is. They act as if it's some sort of reinvestigation where they're going to discover new things. That is not true. And everyone who's involved in it is selling the line that's in that book. And the line that's in that book is that Burke killed JonBenét, and they just go through their various proofs. And one of them is this. And you have this pseudo-expert claim that 911 is help. And so you're going to stay on the phone with 911. Whatever. You're going to get the information out there that you need to get out there. Then you're probably going to get annoyed by the 911 operator who keeps asking you stupid questions that aren't related to what you want, which is help. And then maybe you're going to hang up. We've looked at a lot of cases with 911 calls. The one case where the person stayed on the phone the whole time to the extent that they wouldn't get off the phone to help their kids or even open the door for the police was the Darlie Routier case. And she totally killed her kids. She stayed on the 911 call for as long as you could imagine. And she's totally guilty. And to me, I think it's more strange that you just hang out on the phone with the operator when the police are on their way, when there are other things going on, like where's my daughter or helping my kids or whatever. Like, you're just going to hang out on the phone? To me, that's weird. Now, you may not think it is, but once again, this is the problem. Like, just because it's weird to me doesn't mean it might be weird to Patsy. Maybe she would stay on the phone, but she didn't. And you just can't, I just don't think you can judge or determine really anything based on how long she stayed on the phone or didn't stay on the phone.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We have a lot of 911 calls in our cases, usually multiple, someone reporting a shooting or a break-in or something like that. And honestly, most of the 911 calls, I'm thinking back to just my kind of repertoire of experience, they mostly trail off like this. And it's usually the 911 operator saying something like their name over and over and over. And it's just because they're trying to keep them calm, telling them to breathe. Really, they're just trying to be a therapist on the line until the police get there. And so, in my experience, people do not end 911 calls with, well, thank you for your time, 911. I will wait patiently for the police. I will hang up now. Click. No, it's usually like the phone is fallen to the wayside and you hear weeping.
Yeah, or it gets interrupted by something else that's going on. Like thinking through some that I've heard where, they're calling for whatever reason. They've given the information. There are other people there. There's just other things going on. And the 911 call, after you deliver the information, kind of stops being important to you because you're busy with what it is that caused you to call 911 in the first place. Now, this is obviously different if it's a situation where there's like an ongoing attack, where you are being attacked by somebody. And then the 911 operator really is like a lifeline, and I can imagine you would not want to get off the phone with them. But a lot of times they sort of give the information and then go, and then it just kind of ends. And we've seen that a lot. And at the end of this, another thing on the CBS show is this analysis of what happens at the end. And you can hear Patsy saying something like, "Help me, Jesus." And that seems pretty clear. But the CBS conspiracy theorists have this whole idea that there's this whole conversation at the end. And if you watch it, there's a very contrived moment where they're listening to it at some sort of audio engineering studio, and they're very shocked to hear what they think is other voices on the line, and maybe even one of them's Burke, and that proves that they were lying, and Burke was really awake, and Burke is saying something like, "What did you find?" And they're saying something like, "We're not talking to you." And that is crap. It is total crap. People who know what they're doing have listened to this. The FBI, the Secret Service have listened to this. There is nothing on the end of this call. That's the first thing. The second thing, if there is anything, it's audio artifacts. They use the same tape over and over again when they were doing this. You're always going to have artifacts. And what you're doing is you're listening to this, and it's pure pareidolia. And we've talked about this on the podcast before about how you can hear things in static. When I was in Tuscaloosa, where the fair University of Alabama is, respect, didn't win it this year, maybe next year. But anyways, and I've told you guys about this before, I was part of this like ghost hunting paranormal investigation group. And one of the things you do is you're constantly listening to static in haunted houses that you've recorded in haunted houses to try and hear something. Do you hear voices and ghosts or whatever? It's called EVPs. It's the same thing. Like, you're listening to this static, and the thing that will make you hear something in it is if someone else says, "I hear XYZ." If someone tells you that, you will hear it because your mind is trying to make sense of chaos. It's trying to find patterns in the noise. So the fact that any police officer or anyone who claims to be a serious investigator in this case would try and tell you what the words are at the end of this call is absurd. It really should make you question their credibility across the board when it comes to this case, because whatever is or isn't on the end of this call, you're not going to be able to make it out. And it is simply not the case that it has been definitively determined what was said. If you read Thomas's book, I mean, he's going to act like they heard Burke. Burke was definitely on the call. That's just not true. It's just not true. You cannot say that 100%. And that's one of the things that really irritates me about this case, because there's so much false information, and that is a huge piece of it. And of all the things CBS did in their documentary, that might have been the most disingenuous one and the most damaging one.
Yeah, Brett, I have to agree with you. Hearing the unedited version, not an enhanced version, I don't hear anything. And I think it's such a short amount of period to be able to definitively say there's another voice or a conversation happening. I really think that is people inserting something that is not there.
Yeah, and look, there may be those of you out there who you hear this and you think this actually does make Patsy Ramsey seem more guilty. Obviously, we're always interested in hearing your thoughts on that, but I will tell you that when I listen to this 911 call, it does not make me think she's guilty. It doesn't necessarily make me think she's not, just because I think people can act and can fake emotion. They can absolutely do that, but there's certainly nothing in it that makes me think, that's weird. That doesn't seem like the reaction someone would have. She's being evasive. She's not answering the questions. She's not giving helpful information. I just don't hear that in this call.
Right. I don't think it goes either way, but it doesn't fall outside of the spectrum of what's to be expected for someone who has actually had their daughter kidnapped. Now, let's move on and talk about the reaction to JonBenét's kidnapping and the finding of her body. One of the reasons that suspicion immediately fell upon the Ramseys was their reaction to the kidnapping and the eventual finding of JonBenét's body. According to Thomas's account, the detective on the scene, Linda Arndt, reported that the Ramseys' cold, unemotional response set her off. It made her feel like they had something to hide. And although Patsy seemed to cry, she wasn't seen to actually shed any tears. And John seemed nonchalant. Officer French would say that while Patsy had her hands over her face, she was looking through her splayed fingers as if she was making sure he was watching her show emotion. So, what's to make of this? First, it's really hard to say how much of this is even true and how much of it is either a production of the year's effect on memory or French's immediate suspicion on the family. Let's start with French. Officer Rick French was a patrol officer. He was the first one to respond to the home, as we've already talked about. He was not a detective. He probably had never worked a kidnapping or a murder before. This is not to say that his intuition wasn't accurate, but there's also no reason to think that he had any special insight or experience into how a kidnapping victim's family would react or the inner workings of the Ramseys' minds. Moreover, his initial report does not mention anything strange about the way either Ramsey behaved. In fact, he referred to them as, quote, distraught. Other Boulder Police Department reports state that he believed the Ramseys were acting appropriately for the situation. Now, this goes back to what we say time and again. The reports written at the time of the incident are really important because those are your present sense impressions. They're close in time, and you're supposed to write down everything that you observe and see within that report. Because he didn't mention any of these odd behaviors he notes years later or later on down the line, it just doesn't lend as much credibility to those observations because they weren't noteworthy enough for him to put it into the report. And in fact, his report contradicts what he later says is like stilted reaction from the Ramseys.
This was one of the most surprising things about our look at this case because I had heard this so often. I mean, the whole like looking through her splayed fingers thing and that they were nonchalant and they weren't distraught. You just hear that so often. And I assumed when we looked at sort of the few reports we have that we would see that officers' initial reaction would be they do not seem to be acting the way we would expect them to act if they really had a kidnapping, and that they would reflect the things that we had heard over and over and over again, and they're just not in there. And I'm not sure exactly where they came from or when French started saying this stuff or when Arndt started saying this stuff, but it doesn't seem like it's in the initial reports. And Linda Arndt is really kind of all over the place throughout this case. It's difficult to take much of what she says as true on face value. First, her relationship with the Ramseys was a strange one. We've talked about this before, that initially she seemed to be incredibly loyal to them, particularly Patsy. You got Thomas in his book complaining that she's not sharing information that Patsy had given to her and how unprofessional he thought that was. But then at other times, you have her claiming that she's locking eyes with John Ramsey over JonBenét's body and wondering whether or not everyone's going to make it out of there alive. So once again, I think like Alice said, the best thing to do is to sort of go back to those initial police reports. And if you look at Arndt's initial police report, she states that Patsy was in shock, that she was dazed, that she would start crying suddenly, collapsing in tears, which seems to contradict other statements that there were no tears, that she would moan to herself, "Why didn't I hear my baby?" which seems like a very natural thing for a parent to do in that situation. Arndt also writes that she caught John sobbing on several occasions, and at times he was simply unable to speak. I think the caught him crying is he's trying to be the strong one. He's trying not to break down, but it's happening to him. He's having these moments of quote unquote weakness. There's also been, you'll read comments, Thomas talks about this in his book, that John didn't seem to care about this call that was supposed to be coming in, which indicated he knew there was no call, that when the phone would ring, that's not the call. He knew that because he knew there were no kidnappers. But in Arndt's report, she's writing that every time the phone rings, John's running into the den where they'd set up the recorder to answer it. And every time the phone rings, he's nervous and reacting the way you would expect somebody to react who's waiting on this important phone call. So once again, this has been something that's really affected the way people think about this case because the Ramseys, there's no reason not to say it. It was weird. There were things they did that were weird. And there were things they did that made people doubt them. The hiring the lawyers as quickly as they did. Whoever's idea it was, whether it was their friend or not, the fact that they lawyered up, the fact that they went and talked to the police, the fact that they went on CNN so early, just their general affect seemed a little different than what the average person was used to. The whole beauty queen pageant thing seemed strange to a lot of people. and particularly made people put Patsy in a bad light in a lot of people's eyes. So then when you heard this, when you heard these things, it cemented in your mind they must have done it. And it turns out most of what you've heard just isn't true.
Yeah, I think that's right, Brett. This is one of those instances where everything I've heard about their reactions is contradicted by the close in time official police reports. So this is, if we were taking this to court and officers Arndt and French were saying this now on the stand, they would be absolutely cross-examined with their original police reports that contradict what they later say. And it probably would come out in the wash that the jury just wouldn't believe what they said at all. And so it probably would not hold a lot of weight in a jury's mind, their testimony about a strange behavior from the Ramseys.
Brett, after a long day, I just want to curl up on the couch and get lost in a gripping story with characters I can love and hate. Is that too much to ask? Nope. Thanks to Sundance Now, I always have something to watch that's binge-worthy and that I can be obsessed with. Sundance Now is an ad-free streaming service created by AMC Networks for people who obsess over riveting storytelling and fresh perspectives.
Sundance Now has original prestige dramas, international thrillers, and our favorite, bone-chilling true crime shows. Every show is a sleek production with sexy lead characters. I have been working my way through the series, A Discovery of Witches. I know a lot of you have reached out and said you enjoy it. It's the perfect mix of period drama, romance, and edge-of-your-seat thriller. Seasons 1, 2, and the third and final season are now available for streaming. And if you're looking for something in the true crime realm, I recommend checking out Ministry of Evil, which is an awesome series on Sundance about a cult-turned-criminal enterprise.
You can stream Sundance Now on all your favorite devices for as low as $4.99 a month. Just download the app and watch online and discover exclusive shows from around the world instantly. I found my next TV obsession on Sundance Now, and you will too. Try Sundance Now free for 30 days by going to sundancenow.com and use promo code prosecutors. That's sundancenow.com, code prosecutors for 30 days of free streaming. sundancenow.com, code prosecutors.
Alice, before we continue, I want to talk about one of our newest sponsors, Surfshark VPN. This episode of The Prosecutors is brought to you by Surfshark, and we are happy to have them on board. This video is not available in your location. Does that sound familiar? If it does, then let me tell you why a VPN is the solution to your problem. A VPN doesn't only increase online privacy, which you need, trust me, and help you avoid hackers. It also helps you access entertainment because the content you see is limited by your geographic location.
But if you use a VPN, you can change your virtual location and forget about restrictions and censorship. Can't find what to watch on Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, or other streaming platforms? Unlock new libraries with a VPN. Can't watch a YouTube video? Connect to a different location with a VPN. Can't access certain websites or apps through school or office networks? Try a VPN. So try Surfshark risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Get Surfshark VPN at surfshark.deals/prosecute. Enter promo code PROSECUTE for 83% off and 3 extra months free. You heard me right, 3 extra months for free. That's surfshark.deals/prosecute.
Now let's talk about Patsy's outfit. We've alluded to this a few times. The day that JonBenét went missing, Patsy was wearing the same outfit as she'd worn at the party the night before. She then reapplied her makeup and went downstairs. It was at this point that she discovered JonBenét was gone. The Boulder police found this incredibly suspicious. They simply did not believe it possible that Patsy would wear the same clothes 2 days in a row, particularly when she'd worn the outfit to a party and was now wearing it to get on a plane. This is undisputed, at least from the Ramsey's perspective. Patsy acknowledged that she wore the same outfit the morning as the night before. And the question is just whether she took the clothes off or whether she kept them on all night. If she kept them on all night, the theory is that she killed JonBenét and never had time to change. By the way, if that were the case, there would probably be a lot more DNA and fiber evidence on JonBenét and on her based on her clothing. That was not found to be the case. And so the question is, how strange is it for a woman of her place in society, right? This is a family that's written about in the local papers, and they have a private plane, and she was a former beauty queen, and her daughter is in pageants. Would she deign to wear the same outfit twice? I'm going to go ahead and say, sure, why not? Because is it strange? It could be, but is it outside of the realm of believability? Possibly not. So she wore a nice outfit that was probably holiday appropriate, right? For the party the night before. She is not planning to see any of these people the next day because their plan is to get up and get on a plane to go see family in another state whom they haven't seen yet, whom they haven't seen wear her clothes. And it might just be that, I don't know about you, but my kids, for example, they had a bunch of holiday clothes. By a bunch of holiday clothes, I really mean like 3 or 4 outfits that we used in rotation for the month of December. And we wore them all the time. We wore them for pictures with Santa. We wore them when we went to the Christmas tree farm. We wore them when we went out to our holiday dinner with family. And we wore them to open presents because they were cute outfits that fit the holidays, and they cost money. And I'm not going to have them wear kind of Christmas-themed outfits in March. And so I was trying to get as much use out of them during the holiday season. So if you saw my kids' pictures during the month of December, it looks like they wore the same 2 or 3 outfits because they kind of did. Was that what Patsy was doing here? That is a possibility, especially if no one was going to see her who saw her the night before. And I don't know about you, but on a plane, generally, my clothes are going to be dirty. I usually change when I get to my destination anyway, so it doesn't really matter what I wore. And just in general, have I worn clothes that I wore the night before? Yes, I absolutely have.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I admit my bias was to think this was strange. Just because I thought, oh, Patsy wouldn't wear the same outfit twice, but I don't know Patsy. I mean, I would. That's the thing. Like, this would not be unusual for me at all. Like, I would totally do this. I would totally go to a party and then, if I had to get up early the next day, just grab whatever I took off and get ready to go. Not worry about finding something new to wear. But I think the idea you put your finger on it is just, would the person who's like Patsy, the beauty queen or whatever, do this? And this is something Thomas points to a lot. I mean, this was like really important to him that she did this. And is this evidence? I mean, this is such a weird thing. Like, what is this evidence of? I mean, I guess it's very weak circumstantial evidence, but it's based entirely on your own biases, I mean, would you do this or not? Do you think she would do this or not?
And furthermore, Brett, it's weak circumstantial evidence because there's no evidence that Patsy definitively would not do something like this. Right? You said it's very personal whether you would do something like this. And let's throw in the fact that they were at a party the night before. There was maybe alcohol, especially if I'm particularly tired the next morning because I've been at a late party or I've been drinking. I don't care what I look like. But I think it's weak circumstantial evidence because there is no testimony or statements to the contrary that Patsy is the type of person who would never do something like this. And in fact, you know what? If she had some role in the death of her daughter, whether it was she killed her or she helped cover it up, I would absolutely take a shower and change clothes because the clothes that I was wearing would have a bunch of evidence on it.
Right. That's a good point. This whole notion that she just never changed her clothes, it's just funny to think about. You have to believe that Patsy killed JonBenét, staged the body downstairs, went to a lot of trouble to do so, wrote a really long note, disposed of some evidence, including some rope and the paintbrush and the pages from the pad where she did the first ransom note. She did all that, but she didn't change her clothes. She didn't wash her clothes. She didn't, you have to believe that she wiped the batteries down in the flashlight so there wouldn't be fingerprints on them, but she didn't throw the clothes she was wearing in the washing machine. I mean, that to me is just bizarre, and maybe she just forgot to do that. But if I'm weighing, would she have done all these things and then not washed her clothes versus is it possible she just decided to wear the same thing twice? I think it's much more likely that she just decided to wear the same thing twice.
I'm not sure I would present this evidence if I were trying to try a murder case against Patsy. I would count this as such weak evidence, it would look like I were grasping as the prosecution. I'm just talking about my own thinking of this piece of evidence. I'm not even sure I would put it in there.
Yeah, I mean, I would need some really strong evidence that this was so out of character for her, that it's just impossible to believe that she would do it. I would need something like that. Not just Steve Thomas thinks it's weird, or Scott Thomas, whatever the hell his name is. Not just that Thomas thinks it's weird. I need something much stronger than that if I'm going to rely on this to say that this woman sort of brutally murdered her daughter. But, that's just me. Now, they had other evidence they were looking at. Fiber evidence is a part of this case, and in some ways, it's pretty strong fiber evidence. You have fibers that are consistent with a coat that Patsy owned that are on JonBenét's body and on the tape that was on JonBenét's mouth. Now, I have a couple questions about this. Number one, the fact that they're on her body is almost completely irrelevant, given everything that happened to that body after it was discovered. The way it was carried upstairs, people are throwing themselves on top of it, the blankets on top of it, the sweatshirts on top of it, all that stuff. There's going to be all sorts of fibers on her that'll be related to all sorts of people, and they don't necessarily tell us anything. The duct tape's a little bit stronger because the duct tape was left downstairs, so a lot of the contamination that happened initially would not have affected the duct tape. But you got to remember, the body was found in this room, and just outside, Patsy had these painting supplies and that were things that she used. This was a room where presents were kept, other items were in. It's not clear that Patsy would not have ever been in this room, and in fact, she probably was in it quite recently, and this is Patsy's home. Fibers from her clothes are going to be all over it. So even if you have this piece of duct tape, even if the duct tape was brought from outside, it's certainly possible you could have something like this happen. And fiber evidence, I just have to remind you, it's not perfect. We're not saying there are fibers from her coat on the duct tape. The best you can say is they are consistent with those coats, and they may be consistent with a lot of different clothes. A lot of innocent people have ended up in jail on the basis of fiber evidence. If you're going to use fiber evidence, it needs to be connected to something else. There needs to be things to back it up. You guys may remember when we talked about Laura Dickinson, there was fiber evidence in that case, but the way it was used was proper. They surrounded it with other evidence, and they explained why in the context of the evidence as a whole it was significant. Here, you have some fibers that may be consistent with some clothes in the home where the body was found. Just don't know how powerful that is.
Yeah, especially right after Christmas, a room where there are wrapped gifts. As a parent who recently went through the holidays, I was hiding gifts all over the house and in every corner of the house where I hid gifts. And I always joke that I'm going to be implicated in any murder that happens in my house because I have long dark hair, and my hair just I don't know. Maybe it's postpartum stuff. My hair falls out everywhere. I have hair everywhere. I vacuum, it doesn't matter. My hair is on every piece of everything in this house, including in rooms that I don't think I'd go into. I only say that to say it's my home, and I leave traces of myself where I live. And I would actually be frankly surprised if Patsy's fibers and, other DNA wasn't found in her own home. It would indicate to me that she tried to clean.
It's like that Dashboard Confessionals song
What?
that ends with like, your hair's everywhere. It's about it's about this couple that breaks up, and he's like keeps finding her hair everywhere, and every time he finds her hair, it reminds him of her, but it's everywhere because she was in his house. Anyways,
No,
so
but
yeah,
that's actually sorry if that grosses anybody else, but any person out there who has long hair knows this to be a struggle. To keep your
exactly.
house
If you're
clear.
married to somebody with long hair and you try and take a shower, and there's just hair everywhere there as well. So
There you go. All to say is, where you live, you shed fibers and DNA. I don't think this necessarily clears Patsy, but I don't think it's a very strong finger pointing at her, based on the type of fibers that were found and the relatively small amount that were found on JonBenét. So let's talk about something else that Patsy found, and that's the note and the location of that note. The ransom note was found on the back stairway of the house, not the front stairway. Everyone, including the Ramseys and their children, thought this was strange. If you were coming to leave a ransom note, why not leave it on the front steps, which are kind of like the grand entrance? You can't miss it. It's kind of the grand stairwell. Now, this possibly indicated someone who was familiar with the movements of the family, intimately familiar, because the back staircase is actually really narrow and it's circular. It's not, probably only one person could fit down it at one time. But when I grew up, I lived in a house with 2 staircases, and we never used the front staircase. That really was the grand entrance. It was beautiful. It was curved. It came to the front door. But our bedrooms and the kitchen and the living space was all in the back of the house, and we always used the back narrow staircase. So if you left something for me or anyone in our family on the kind of big front staircase, I don't think we'd find it for weeks.
I see people attach a lot of significance to this, whether they think the Ramseys did it or not, sort of indicating this is somebody who knew the family well, like you said, maybe, or maybe they just figured nobody actually uses the big staircase, or maybe they didn't care. Maybe it was close to where they exited, and so that's where they left the note, and they'd find it eventually. It wasn't important to them when they found it. They were going to find it eventually, and then they'd find it. Whether it was they come down the staircase and they go in the kitchen to get breakfast, or they go up and they find JonBenét's room is empty and they're looking for her in the house and they find the note. I mean, this may just have been where they put it. And it wasn't so much, we know you'll come down these steps, but it was just a convenient place to put it.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brett. That back staircase is by the kitchen. It's very likely that JonBenét and her killer were near or around the kitchen, whether it had anything to do with the pineapple and milk or on their way down to the basement. But it may have just been random coincidence that this was the place closest to the murderer at the time, and that's why the note was left there. And yet others have commented on the fact that Patsy did not step on the note as she went down the spiral staircase. But assuming she's not the killer, that is likely accounted for by the very nature of the stairway. You'd probably watch your steps as you're going down, especially because it's a very narrow, tight, circular stairwell that you can't help but see a note on the step. It's not like these steps are huge. They're smaller than your typical grand entrance staircase. So I had a circular staircase in an apartment I lived in, and it was like, we called it the stairwell of death because one misstep and you would just like slide all the way down, or there were like holes in between the stairs. And I was always like nervous that I'd somehow slip through the holes and fall. So I always looked where I was going on that particular staircase. And that staircase was very similar to this back staircase where the note was.
So let's talk about the statistics of child murders. You often hear that in child murders, there are around 72% of murdered children are killed by their parents. It's certainly the case that typically if someone's murdered, the first person you look at are the people who are closest to them. In the event that it's a child, you're often going to look at the parents. It has been difficult. I have attempted to find where this 72% comes from. If somebody out there has this and wants to correct me on this, I'm happy to do that. But the only 72% I could find was a study showing that 72% of children who are murdered by their parents are under 6, which is a very different thing. It's like you're taking a subset of children killed by their parents and how old are they, and 72% are under 6, which doesn't surprise me at all. Now, I was able to find in the late 90s some statistics that showed that around 1,800 children a year were murdered in the late 90s, which is a staggering amount. And it's hard to believe that that's true, but nonetheless, of those, around 500 were murdered by their parents. If you do the math, that's about 28%. So nowhere near as high as you might think, and much, much lower than I would have thought. If you break it down only to the number of children under 6, which JonBenét is right on the edge of that, who are murdered, the numbers still aren't that overwhelming. In 1997, which was a year after the murder, 700 children under 6 were murdered, and a little over 50% of them were killed by their parents. And although we're talking about children under 6, actually the vast majority of these kids are between the ages of 1 and 2. So they're very, very young children. If parents are going to kill their kids, usually it's going to happen when they're infants, when they're toddlers, in those early stages where postpartum depression is still going on and is still causing some really irrational, rage-based behavior. That's usually what you're going to see. Now, doesn't mean that the parents couldn't have killed their kids or that it would have been particularly rare if they did. I'm not saying that. It's just that the statistics don't tell you as much as you think. If you read John Douglas's account of this in The Cases That Haunt Us, this is something he points out, that he had never really seen a case where it seemed like people were relying so much on the statistics to say that the parents were involved without, in his view, a lot of evidence to back it up, and the statistics themselves aren't as strong as people often make them out to be.
And remember, because we have the protections of the Constitution, you can't be convicted based on statistics. You can't, even if the number were 100%. Let's just say 100% of kids, in the year before who were murdered by their parents. That fact alone does not lead to a conviction of parents in general, because you would violate due process. It has to be evidence pertaining to the specific defendants on trial. So I use statistics in things like sentencing to try and get a just outcome that falls within the realm of what other perpetrators get so that there's fairness. But it is difficult and oftentimes prohibited to use statistics like this on a specific murder trial.
Yeah, statistics come in when you're dealing with something like DNA, right? So you can say things like the percentage chance that you would have a match or 1 in 9 billion or whatever. And you might say, well, in some ways that's using statistics, but it's a statistical analysis of actual evidence, not the statistics itself as evidence. And I think that's sort of the line Alice is drawing here. Even if you have a statistic that says a really, really high percentage of, women who are murdered by their significant other, for instance. I mean, imagine that were a really high number, 95%. You can't bring that into trial because it's really prejudicial because the number is so high, but it doesn't actually tell you a lot because we don't know if this person's part of the 5% or not. And it doesn't actually pertain to the case. It's not something that was collected as part of the case or is actually evidence related to the victim or related to the perpetrator. So it's interesting. It's interesting for those of us who just look at these cases and think through them. But when it comes to actually a criminal trial, you do not want people being judged on the basis of statistics.
let's talk about the cause of death, because what actually killed JonBenét? The autopsy left the question open and concluding that her cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. Some have argued that the relatively small amount of blood on the brain indicates that the skull strike was after she'd been strangled. As JonBenét's heart rate slowed and her pulse died away, less blood would have pumped through her body and there would be less bleeding if she were hit. On the other hand, other experts have argued that skull fractures don't typically lead to much bleeding and that the wound could have happened well before strangulation. All to say is the autopsy isn't really helpful here, except that there were 2 fatal wounds to her, both the strangulation and the skull fracture that she suffered.
Why is this important? The evidence we've been going over today and last time is kind of the evidence that's put forward against the parents. And it's pretty important, if you think the parents did it, that the skull fracture happened first. The only scenario I've seen where the strangulation happened first, those of you who've read Cyril Weck's book on this, he sort of concocts this really sort of dramatic, eyes wide shut thing where John is engaged in some sick sex games with JonBenét, and it gets out of hand and she dies, and then the strike happens after that. But other than that, if you think the parents did it, you think that her skull was fractured, she was essentially dead, and this is all just staging. This is just all to make it look like this was some sort of sexual game gone wrong, and the strangulation was not intended to kill her, even if it did, in fact, have some effect on her death and would have killed her were it not for the strike. So this is a really important question, and unfortunately, it's just not one we have a good answer for. The one thing we can say for certain, JonBenét was absolutely alive when she was strangled. There's no question about that. Now, she might have been barely alive, but she was alive, and you can tell because of petechial hemorrhaging, just a lot of the things that happen to your body when you are strangled. And you see that on her. So she was alive. Now, that doesn't mean that it happened first. It doesn't mean that, because she could have been barely alive. She could have been struck on the head an hour before and she's on the verge of death, but her heart's still beating and those effects are still occurring. So it's hard to say for certain what happened here. I don't know that we'll ever know, and this is one of the most frustrating things about this case. But it's the frustrating thing you see over and over again, which is experts who are supposed to be experts, but who all disagree and really don't have a good argument for why one side or the other is correct. And it makes it really hard here because we just don't have any concrete facts.
But we'll say this, especially as we're talking about whether the parents did it. Both the strangulation and the crushing blow to the skull were massively brutal attacks. Whether it was staging or not, the garrote, if you look at it, it's a broken off handle and there's bits of her hair stuck in it. And there takes some force in order to turn the handle so that it is tight enough around the neck. It is not something that anyone could do. It really takes a sick person to do something like that, even if it is for staging purposes, because it is still on the body of someone who's still alive and a young girl. The blow to the head also is not a ding, but rather a crushing blow to the head that would take immense force. I've heard of skulls cracking, never to this degree, but the sound of a skull being cracked is one of the most sickening sounds I can imagine. There's nothing quite like it because the skull is one of the strongest bones in the body, and when it cracks, it is a sound that sends chills through your body because innately you know something like that should not happen. So just keep in mind that both of these injuries are not swift, and they require force by the one who is inflicting the harm. This is not a gunshot wound. This is not even one single stab. But both of these require quite a bit of commitment to execution.
Yeah, and that's one of those things you just have to remember. The theory that the parents did it, the most popular one is this: for whatever reason, whatever the argument was over, whether it was the bedwetting or the clothes they were wearing or whatever, Patsy snapped and maybe pushed JonBenét or threw her across the room, and she struck her head on the corner of something, and it led to this. And I'm not a doctor, and I'm not an expert in these things. The wound that I see does not fit that. It just doesn't. I don't know that it is possible, and I would love to hear from people who are experts in this. I do not know that it is possible to accidentally cause that kind of fracture. You absolutely can accidentally cause a fracture. You can accidentally kill someone by hitting them in the head. But that kind of fracture seems like it would have required some real deliberateness in how you struck somebody. The Burke thing is a little different because that is supposed to be deliberate, whether he's doing it with a golf club or a flashlight. I mean, the whole idea is that he is intentionally striking his sister with a lot of force and that could do this. But the whole throwing her or pushing her or whatever, I just don't know that that's possible. This damage. And if you got the stomach for it and you look at the skull, you're going to see what we're talking about. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, most documentaries don't show it because it is the skull of a child. But if you look at it, it blows your mind. I mean, it is so much worse than anything you've imagined. Whatever you were imagining her fracture looks like, it is so much worse.
Yeah, it's hard to look at even just the skull, which is very clinical.
Right. But weirdly, and this is another one of those things, no one knew it until the autopsy, right? It appears that when her body was collected, her body was found, and the pathologist and everybody else initially looked at her, they did not realize that she had this massive skull fracture because there wasn't any bleeding and it wasn't evident from the outside, which also makes you wonder about the parents' theory, because how would they know? How would they know it was as bad as they thought it was? I mean, even if they had pushed her and she had fell and they did hear the cracking, they would not necessarily have known that it was as bad as it was. We're going to talk about that more later, but it's one of those things that just sticks in the back of my head, that how would they know that it was a situation where JonBenét was going to die and there was no point in getting her help? Might as well cover it up. I mean, I just keep coming back to that a lot. Now, one thing that people talk about a lot in this case, and that fits in with what you think the motive might be, is evidence of prior sexual assault. And like everything else we've talked about, people are all over the map on this. Now, there is evidence of vaginal trauma, very important. It seems to show that JonBenét was assaulted that night. There's material consistent with the paintbrush that was found in her vagina, which indicates that she was assaulted by that night. Now, whether she showed prior sexual abuse is really controversial. You have groups of pediatricians who've looked at her medical records who have concluded that she was. You have other people who've looked at these same medical records and said that she wasn't. There are some people who believe that the autopsy reveals what they term erosion along her hymen, which is consistent with prior assault. There are other experts who have said, no, that came from the trauma that night. They had Dr. Thomas Henry, who was a medical examiner in Denver, and he had this to say. From what is noted in the autopsy report, there is no evidence of injury to the anus. There is no evidence of injury to the skin around the vagina, the labia. There is no indication of healed scars in any of these areas. There is no other indication from the autopsy report at all that there is any other previous injuries that have healed in that area, which obviously seems to indicate that to the extent there was sexual assault, it occurred that night. It wasn't a chronic phenomenon.
This next piece of information, I think, sheds light on whether there was previous trauma. It's often said that JonBenét had been to the doctor on no fewer than 27 occasions, and this evidence is often used to show that she was being abused by someone in her life. The obvious thing to do would be to ask JonBenét's doctor, which people have. And here's what he said. I went through her chart and summarized the types of visits she had in the office in the years prior to her death. She was here 3 times for annual well child visits, 1 time for a stomach ache, 1 time for vaginitis, 1 time for a bruised nose from a fall at a local market, and 21 times for colds, sinusitis, ear infections, bronchitis, pneumonia, hay fever, and possible asthma. A pretty wide spectrum of generally allergy and respiratory system associated problems, which are not uncommon with kids her age. I saw absolutely no signs of sexual abuse. I had no suspicion of it. And here's the thing. If the doctor had suspicion of sexual abuse or child abuse of any sort at any time, he had a duty to report it. All doctors have a duty to report it when it involves minors. So the fact that he did not suspect it at the time or in looking back at his charts, unless you think he somehow bought off or part of this cabal, then I think that is a huge indication that there was not previous sexual trauma that had healed, and that any sexual trauma found in any autopsy came from the night of her murder. I will say 27 times may seem like a lot until you break it down. Really, you're looking at 21 times, and that's for colds and ear infections. I have kids. We are at the doctor all the time. Ear infections left and right, colds all the time, especially in this age of COVID. I think we're at the doctor once a month, if not more. So by the time my child is 6, they will have been to the doctor way more than 27 times, I think.
And when I was 6, around this age, I was going to school, kindergarten or whatever, having a lot of interaction with kids, a lot more than I had before I'd started school. And man, I was sick all the time because I had not had a lot of these illnesses because I didn't go to, preschool or daycare or whatever. And it just wasn't strange to be at the doctor. I was at the doctor more times than this. And yeah, I just feel like when you have kids, you do this, you just feel like you spend all the time at the doctor. You're just there constantly. And a lot of it is for these kind of things. And this just explains away so much. And when that number is given without any kind of context, it's just misleading. I mean, it's just an attempt to mislead you when people do that. And it bothers me because there's a simple explanation for it. Now, look. Maybe she was being abused. Maybe the doctor didn't see the evidence of it because he's negligent. Maybe he'd been bought off. You can speculate about all those things, but you have no proof of any of it. There is no proof that he's been bought off by anybody. There's no proof that he's a bad doctor. You can't point to anything that supports that. And without that, you're just making it up. You're just making that up so that this piece of evidence that you think fits your theory will continue to fit your theory. It's confirmation bias in its purest form. Now, if you can find some evidence that this doctor is corrupt, okay, now we can talk. But until you do that, just saying, well, he was probably bought off because the Ramseys were rich and they had the money. Okay, maybe that's what it was, but you don't know that.
And having prosecuted doctor cases, I can say that everything he says indicates he's a good doctor. The fact that he has detailed notes for 27 occasions and can go back about the diagnosis of each one shows that they were actually notes made in real time. I've prosecuted doctors who forge their records all the time, and they couldn't tell you how many times someone came in, and they certainly wouldn't know what the diagnosis was at the time. So just based on what he's saying, having looked at a lot of patient files and doctors, he sounds like a good doctor to me based on his record keeping. And each of these illnesses he's listed indicate to me that she actually needed some treatment, right? Pneumonia, bronchitis, ear infections, you need antibiotics for those problems. So it actually sounds like she has very attentive parents who brought her in when she needed to be seen. They made every single well child visit. She came for each annual well child visit. To be totally honest, I have been so delayed in getting my children to well child visits. They're required every year or more frequently when their kids are younger, and life will get busy and I'll delay them, and then it kind of smushes the 3 and 6 month, visits together because I waited too long. So the fact that she is being brought for conditions that need to be treated by a doctor and her parents are keeping up with these well visits actually indicates to me that her parents were very attentive to her well-being and her health.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. It does seem to indicate that. And here's the thing, one of the signs if somebody's abusing a child is not taking them to the doctor, because you don't want the doctor to see any of the possible signs of abuse. So you keep them away from the doctor even when they're sick. That did not happen here. I mean, this doctor was seeing her, and you would think that if there were signs of this, he would recognize it. So let's talk about defensive wounds. Defensive wounds are important because if JonBenét has defensive wounds, it means she was fighting back against the garrote, and you would think that that would make the whole parents killed her, or the parents strangled her to cover up the murder. You would think it would make that theory less palatable, because would the parents really strangle their daughter while she's fighting back, indicating that she's still alive? Thomas deals with this directly by arguing that JonBenét was basically dead by the time she was strangled, and he argues there were no defensive wounds to show her struggle against the garrote. The autopsy report seems to challenge that, and we'll read you from the autopsy notes. The remainder of the abrasions and petechial hemorrhages of the skin above and below the anterior projection of the ligature furrow are non-patterned, purple to rust-colored, and present in the midline, right, and left areas of the anterior neck. Now, the question is, are these abrasions wounds from JonBenét fighting against the garrote, or are they just hemorrhaging from strangulation? The autopsy is not clear. You can look at these pictures and decide for yourself. I have heard people say that they see these sort of half-moon indentions in her throat, which are pretty common in a strangulation when you fight back against the garrote. I don't see that, personally. I do see some things that look like scratching and that you might see if someone is fighting back against a garrote. What's interesting about it is there is blood on the garrote itself, and it's JonBenét's blood, which indicates that the wounds did bleed. If they were internal, if they were just petechial hemorrhaging, obviously they wouldn't do that. So it is possible, and maybe even likely, that blood comes from JonBenét scratching herself as she's fighting back against this strangulation.
Now, let's talk about one other unusual thing about JonBenét the night that she was murdered. JonBenét was wearing underwear that was far too large for her, probably for like a 12 or 14-year-old. Patsy had purchased a pair of Bloomingdale underwear in this size, and Patsy indicated she'd intended to give these to her niece, but she never sent the gift and decided instead to give them to JonBenét, putting them in her underwear drawer in JonBenét's bathroom. Patsy's position on this was fairly straightforward. JonBenét liked to wear the bigger clothes, and Patsy let her. But for those who think that Patsy was involved, this is a clue. Their theory is that Patsy, in her rage at her daughter's latest bedwetting, accidentally killed JonBenét, perhaps after putting a pair of oversized underwear on her. Brett, I'm not going to lie, I don't really follow that theory, because I think that theory would be that I'm not sure how the oversized underwear really fits into that, but I guess you could say that JonBenét had normal underwear on that fits her as a 6-year-old. She wets her bed and calls for her mom, and Patsy comes in, and she changes JonBenét from her wet underwear and puts on this oversized underwear instead. Now what? Patsy's not so angry that she hits JonBenét before putting on clean underwear for her, or while she's still wet. You would think the rage is kind of fresh right when you walk into the room and you've just been woken from your slumber and everything's wet, and you think that's when any hitting would happen. But instead, she puts on clean but very large underpants on her daughter, and then after that clean underwear is on, Patsy then hits JonBenét, and it's a strange turn of events. Why have that happen at that time? And I guess Patsy would have had to lie that JonBenét liked to wear larger underwear, but why lie about that? What's the big deal? Why not just put either normal size underwear on her, or if she did like to wear larger underwear, is that so strange that she would be wearing it? I mean, another possibility, of course, is that an intruder did find JonBenét and she had wet her bed, and the intruder didn't really know the placement of JonBenét's clothes and kind of reached into the drawers and pulled out the top clean underwear, which was this larger pair of underwear, and gave it to JonBenét. I just really think this is a red herring, to be honest. It is strange that she's wearing underwear this size. I also have children who have strong minds about what they want to wear. For example, my son, my 4-year-old right now, is intent on wearing what he calls low to the ground pants. Or no, I'm sorry, he calls them low to the ground shorts. In other words, pants. And it's fine because it's winter and he insists on wearing them, but he freaks out, quite frankly, when he doesn't wear pants that he thinks are long enough and quite literally touch the ground. So that's just his latest fashion MO. Thankfully, it's not that strange because it's winter right now and it's pretty normal to wear pants in this weather. But I'm not sure that this larger underwear means anything. I don't see why Patsy would have to lie about JonBenét liking to wear larger underwear, even if Patsy were the one to have killed JonBenét. I think people have focused on this because of the sexual assault element and because it is a little bit strange that she's wearing clothes that don't fit her.
You pick your battles when you have kids. If they want to wear bigger clothes, they can wear bigger clothes. I mean, and I'm with you. I just don't understand why this is important. It's hard for me to figure it out. It's hard for me to... There are so many facts in this case that are difficult for me to fit into a theory. And I feel like this is one of them. Like, why would this be significant? Under what theory would this be significant?
It would really only be significant to me if the underwear belonged to, say, Patsy. But it doesn't. It's too small for Patsy. It's just that it's a large pair of underwear, and she does have a niece around this age, and that seems believable to me that there would be, that she would actually buy these for someone but not actually have mailed them. I do that all the time, unfortunately. I'm just not very organized.
And, if Patsy's trying to stage this and make it look an intruder, then why not just say, I have no idea why she's wearing those. Must have been the intruder. I wouldn't make that mistake. Like that would be the thing to say if you were going to lie about it. Why just say, oh yeah, she liked bigger underwear, so she wore those all the time. I let her use them. I mean, like you said, if you think this is a rage-inspired incident where Patsy is so tired and so overwhelmed that the fact that she got awakened again by her daughter who wet the bed leads her to throw her across the room and kill her, she would do that immediately. She would not clean her up, change her clothes, put on the bigger underwear, and then murder her. Like, why would she snap at that point? It just doesn't really even make sense. So, and in that instance, then Patsy is telling the truth. Like, even if that were true, even if that's exactly what happened, it's still the case that JonBenét liked to wear those underwear, right? Like, that's why she put them on her in that situation. So, whether Patsy killed her or not, it doesn't actually seem like the underwear tell us anything. Like, I just don't see what it adds. So if someone can explain that to me about why this underwear is important, I'm all ears. I would love to hear it. But to me, I don't think this tells us anything. I don't think this tells us it's an intruder. I don't think this tells us it's Patsy. I just think JonBenét liked to wear these underwear. So we have covered a lot today. We've gone through a lot of evidence. We've made some pretty strong statements about a lot of it. So we're obviously interested to hear what you guys think. Hit us up at Prosecutors Pod on all your social media. prosecutorspod@gmail.com if you want to send us an email. Check us out on YouTube, Reddit. There are so many ways to contact us. Go to Facebook, the gallery. I am sure they are talking about this case. Would love to take part in the discussion with you there. We are moving through this. We've sort of wrapped up today the evidence that's generally pointed to against the Ramseys. We're going to talk about the evidence for an intruder next week and whether any of that actually holds up. And then eventually we're going to get to our theories about this case and finish up and never talk about JonBenét Ramsey again. But for all of you who wanted to hear this case, this is your punishment. We are 6 episodes in, and we are not yet finished. So you're welcome. Well, Alice, do you have anything to add before we sign off for today?
That's it. But come on back because we really are moving towards the end quickly now.
Yes. All right, guys. We'll see you next week for more on JonBenét Ramsey. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. From the ransom, from JonBenét, we are going to call.
We're about to play the 911 call made after Patsy found the ransom note and discovered JonBenét was missing.
Thank you, Alice. Here we go.
I'm sorry, I just had to do that. We're here for each other, Brett.
Yes, here for each other. Okay, split it now.
Looking for shows you'll love to death? This Valentine's Day, solve the what to watch mystery with Pluto TV. Investigate true crime series like Forensic Files and FBI Files, or serial binge classics like CSI and Narcos. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of other channels and thousands more movies and TV shows, all for free. Download the Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start watching today. Pluto TV. Drop in, watch free.